Well, hello everybody. I'm the new chair of CORESS, Neil Mortensen. This is the 2024 Safety and Surgery Symposium. You're all very, very welcome. I became chair only a few months ago, and following in the footsteps of Lord Ribeiro, I've always been extremely keen, nay, passionate about surgical safety and learning lessons from things when they go wrong, as they inevitably do in something as complex as the surgical environment. We've got a great afternoon ahead of us, and I'm now going to hand over to Harriet Corbett, who is the Programme Director for CORESS, who will be introducing the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and it's a pleasure to have you as our new chair. We're really excited about what we can achieve going forwards. So for those of you who are not familiar with CORESS, we're here to learn from as many incidents as we can, ideally from near misses, but of course not always, unfortunately, a near miss, but an actual event. We're here to sort of extract the learning from every incident that we can, and we had a lively advisory board discussion this morning. I can see some of the advisory board members are here, about some of the cases that have been reported over the past few months. But this afternoon's a little bit different. We're here to learn from some of our esteemed colleagues. I'm really delighted to welcome Adam as our first speaker. Those of you who know the background to CORESS will know that we're based on the system set up by CHIRP. Adam may or may not tell us a little bit about CHIRP, but there's lots on the website if you want to know more. Adam's from the maritime side rather than the aviation side, and I suspect it was more the aviation side that got us going, but nonetheless the lessons are valid wherever they come from. I think the title of your talk, Adam, has really got me interested, because there are near misses that we're not learning from in surgery and healthcare as well, and so I'm really fascinated to hear what you can tell us about that. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, if I may. If I could ask the rest of the speakers just to keep cameras off while we're hearing from Adam, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end, I hope. Thank you.
That's perfect. Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. So I'm just going to pull up these slides. You'll be pleased to know that for Friday afternoon, I don't have a huge number of slides. So there we go. Hopefully you can see that. So I was delighted to be asked to come and have a chat to you about why aren't we learning from incidents, because this is my daily experience since I've taken over this job in the just over 3 and a bit years ago. For those that aren't aware of CHIRP, and many people aren't, even in the maritime industry, so there's absolutely no reason why you would be in CORESS or any of your people watching this. So we have been around since 1982, initially for the aviation domain, as an independent, impartial, confidential reporting system. That was driven largely by legislation to be the UK Civil Aviation Authority, like every other aviation authority in the world, is mandated to have effectively an independent whistleblowing, but it's not quite whistleblowing service, in order that people have an avenue and an outlet to raise their safety concerns that didn't go through their company. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. We initially were set up, as I say, 82 for aviation. That worked very well. That's still ongoing. The job for anybody who wants to do a career change of the aviation lead for that is just come up. And then since 2003, we had a maritime program as well, which, so only just over 21 years old. We have, unlike the aviation program, we look at the maritime industry worldwide, and that's a function of the different funding mechanisms. We are funded solely in the aviation program by the CAA, who are only interested really in UK aircraft or the UK airspace, whereas the maritime industry is funded by a portfolio of funders, such as Lloyd's Register Foundation, TK Foundation, Trinity House, Seafarers Charity, and some others, and a few donations as well from altruistic people or organizations. And as a result of the our funders' wishes, we actually do this worldwide. And so it's quite a challenge. There are 2 million commercial seafarers out there as we speak, and about 30 million commercial fishers. So it's quite a large body of people out there, and that actually causes some issues and lots of opportunities, as I'm going to explain in a moment. I was lucky enough to get this job 3 years ago, and it's absolutely fascinating. It can be slightly pessimistic, because people inevitably only want to tell you that something's gone or going wrong. So you need to be quite a cheerful disposition. And I'm just going to go through a few of these things. So my next slide, if it comes up. This is the key takeaway. This is what we tell everybody. It actually says, the original quote says, learn from the mistakes of others. But that's not particularly a very just culture, blame-free culture type phrase to put up. So we've doctored it slightly. And we say, you know, it's about learning from the experiences of others. Because, and although this is slightly flippant, it actually speaks to a more profound issue, which is when you go to any organization, and I suspect that the medical industry is no different, if you have an incident in your organization, you instantly become the world's experts in how not to do that again. The issue is, of course, is the organization down the road from you who haven't yet, or perhaps fortunately haven't yet had that experience. Unless you tell them about your learning, you've almost doomed them to have to learn it the hard way themselves. And we do see this, and I'll explain this in a moment, in the aviation, but even more so the maritime industries over and over again. The maritime industry is wonderfully fragmented. If I started to explain to you how the maritime industry works for a particular ship, take a ship run by owned by company A, leased to company B, chartered to company C, moving, but flag state is company D or organization D. It's being insured by some company E. It's having moving stuff for companies, as many letters of the alphabet as you like, to move it from country F to country G en route via HG&I. And all of a sudden, you just realize the sheer complexity of trying to understand and even worse, try to bring together this sort of, it's not even federated, this loose, chaotic connection of organizations, of people, literally multilaterally, all speaking different languages, all with different perspectives, all wanting to get something different out of it, although mostly united in the desire to make a profit, in an exceptionally competitive industry, which does not incentivize in any way the ability to go over and above the mandated minimum requirements. And so mandated minima instantly become mandated maxima. And as a result, of course, we know that nobody can be on their A game 100% of the time. And inevitably, things go wrong. And that's why we're here. I spoke about legislation a few times now. Interestingly, the International Maritime Organization have set out in their objectives for a safety investigation several things. And they've said you need to prevent, improve, and reduce future accidents. And there is a whole host of legislation by the the Maritime Safety Committee, talking about how you prevent an incident, and the aim, they've got legislation and guidance on how to improve having had something. But there's absolutely no regulatory requirement to learn from an incident, which is quite interesting because, of course, how do you improve if you haven't learned? And as one of the human factors gurus has said, you know, you don't actually learn from having an incident, you learn from reflecting on having that incident. And of course, if you don't talk, share, discuss, you aren't reflecting, and therefore it's almost a non sequitur. You can't improve. So there's a real issue here. And CHIRP is voluntary by nature, precisely because there is no regulatory requirement. There are moves afoot. The IMO, the Food Agriculture Organization, and a couple of other UN bodies are actually now talking about mandating the reporting of fishing incidents. It's a sad fact that actually nobody to within 10 to 15,000 can tell you how many people die at sea every year. Even if you go to a single country, I take Alaska as an example. Alaska say, well, if you have a death at sea caused by a fisherman who's actually in the process of fishing, that goes to one reporting system. If somebody has an accident on board a fishing vessel, but they're not actually fishing, they might have been off watch or fallen down the ladder trying to get to the mess room, that's a completely different organization. If they've gone to sea and and that's if it's work related. If they've gone to sea and they've had mental issues and they end up taking their own life, well, that's a third organization. And guess what? None of these organizations even speak to each other within the same country. And so, shockingly, the best guess at the moment by the International Labour Organization is that we lose about 36,000 fishermen a year. The Pew Trust recently did a study, and they say, look, conservatively, we think this is about 100,000 a year. And it really doesn't matter which one of those figures is correct. And that's not me being callous about the 70,000 people difference. That's me saying that at best case, we're killing a fisherman every 15 minutes. At worst case, we're killing a fisherman every 5 minutes. Neither of those two figures is a good figure to own up to. The important thing is we should be getting this down by orders of magnitude. We have a problem in the fishing industry. These are figures that are pulled together by Allianz and a couple of other insurance clubs. And these are facts. And again, I've just said about the numbers. We're not entirely certain. None of these numbers are entirely accurate. They're all pretty much best guesses based on extrapolation from other things. But we do know that we have around at least 2,700 incidents globally. And all these are minima. These are things that people are aware of, and there's lots of things that go on that we're not aware of. For perspective, I read somewhere the other day that about 80 people die of respiratory issues over Delhi every year caused by tire dust. So I have to be quite sanguine and put into context that whilst to me, 16 people dying in an enclosed space, which is a space on board a vessel, which doesn't have an atmosphere to sustain life because it's normally not ventilated, or the cargo therein sucks and absorbs the oxygen up, or it gives off some noxious fumes. So 16, although that's personally very tragic for them, trying to get, if you like, big maritime interested in this, it's really, really hard. But there is a real so what to all of these figures. Roughly on that page, I think I've got something like 1/3 people die a year-ish. But if Dunbar's number's correct, which is that we all know around 150 people, then we're talking potentially that of those 300 and something thousand deaths per annum at sea, the people who are affected by those deaths actually is about the same size as the entirety, in fact, slightly larger than the entire population of Spain every single year. And that's absolutely horrific, absolutely shocking. And yet that just, it's okay, because we tend, unfortunately, to lose people in ones and twos. The terrible thing about having an aviation... I missed that, sorry. Okay. The terrible thing about having an aviation incident is that if you crash an
clonidine, magnesium, clonidine.
Sorry, somebody out there, could you please mute? I'm trying to see who it is, but we're hearing some background noise. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll go back. So what I was going to say about this is the terrible thing about crashing an aircraft, if you're a commercial airline pilot, is that you've killed 300 people. Weirdly, the great thing about killing 300 people is that something tends to get done because it's such a large issue. But we're not losing an aviation passenger or a pilot every 5 minutes. But we are losing that many people of fishers. But because it's happening in ones and twos and threes, it all happens under the radar, and therefore nothing much gets done about it. And I know this isn't great Friday afternoon, happy, and it's healthy cynicism, but unfortunately, it's just the way it is. But if we look at, if we accept that Hunnigher's triangle is correct, 1 death, 29 serious incidents, 300 near misses, then if we take those, I should be seeing about 300,000 minimum reports a year about deaths alone, up to around about just shy of 100 million near miss reports a year. But there's nothing, they don't exist. There's a good reason for why people aren't reporting. And I realized as I was typing this out earlier that there's lots of R's in here. I'm not trying to be a bad DJ and make it all rhyme. But the hurdles are quite obvious, and they could, he says, be relatively easily overcome if there was an appetite. In some countries, reporting systems just simply aren't available. That's a big hurdle. The issue for a lot of people is they literally don't even recognize that they've had a near miss, because lots of people have near misses all the time, and they're so minor that actually even trying to understand that there's an issue is a real hurdle. And I'll give you an example of an Icelandic fisherman that reported to us putting his hand into a winch, or got it pulled into a winch by a wire, and he lost the ends of 3 fingers. That was reported to us as a near miss on the basis that it wasn't his writing hand. Now, if you don't recognize that losing the ends of your fingers is a serious thing, the chances are that person's never going to be reporting what I genuinely believe to be a near miss, as opposed to what I actually recategorized as a serious incident. Another issue that causes people not to report is just fear of rejection. Lots of people, unfortunately, in the industry don't want to hear bad news. So you raise an issue, and it's literally rejected out of hand as scaremongering, fear-mongering, or people just don't want to know because, and it's quite often easier, which comes to the next one, redundancy reprisals. It's easier to get rid of the reporter than it is to fix the issue that's being reported upon. Another big thing when it comes to near misses is, of course, it takes a lot of moral courage, I think, to stand up and say, hey, I nearly did something really stupid. That tend to be how people put it, even though it's not stupid. The fact is that by standing back and going, oh, that was a near miss, I better not do that again, and telling everybody else about it so they don't do it either. That's actually really mature. Unfortunately, lots of workplaces, people get ridiculed, or they're pointed out, or they're worried about their promotion prospects because they're now seen as the liability. Or even worse, people make all these reports and then nothing changes that they can see. Because quite often what changes, and I can't speak for the surgical community, but certainly in the maritime domain, the pace of change is often glacial, and I'm talking measured in decades. And therefore, people don't see that actually by making a report, they can actually get things changed. And a really good example of that is the pilot ladders, the maritime pilot ladders, that effectively a rope ladder that you get hanging off of a treehouse, dangling down the side of a ship. In the UK alone, about 500,000 of those are climbed every year. And if you talk to the International Maritime Pilots Association, they, from the reports that they manage to squeeze out of their pilots, can say we think about 15 to 20% of those are non-compliant. If you actually talk to individual pilots, and for those who have got a real niche interest in this subject, I doubt there are very many watching this now, there's a Dutch guy called Arie Palmers, who every single week without fail goes on LinkedIn, takes pictures and says, right, this week I have climbed 8 ladders, and not less than 50% on any given week are non-compliant, i.e. there is more ladders on non-compliant than are, but because they're not reported en masse by the entire pilot cohort, it's taken about 45 years for the legislation and for the requirements to change, and it's still happening at incremental glacial pace, as opposed to we need to do something really radically different. And to tell you about the number of reports, this is I took this morning just to make sure it was up to date. So the International Maritime Organization mandates all countries who are a member of the UN that have a coastline to report their very serious incidents or serious incidents. Very serious, normally death and destruction. Serious, your vessel sunk, but you might not have killed somebody, but it's still very bad. And as you can see there, a massive 51 results have been reported in the calendar year since the 4th of October last year. But we know that there are a minimum of 2,500. So there's a massive, massive disconnect. That's not that people aren't reporting in their own country. That's even at country level, the countries themselves systemically have an issue reporting to the IMO. And so if nobody's passing this stuff on, and no reports equals no issue, there is no pressure on the IMO, who are the ultimate body for making international regulations at sea, to make any changes, because nobody's going to make a change, because change involves cost if there is no clear evidence base. And so without that evidence base, nothing's happened.
Consent 4 is here.
Within a particular sector, whether it's CPOC, whether it's fishing, whatever it is, this is an unabashedly maritime slide. I apologize, but if you have an issue, you can relate. If you have an issue on board your own organization, whether it's a simple near miss or it's a very severe incident, chances are you've recorded it on board. Or no, that's not true. You may well have recorded it on board. By the time you've passed that up to the company who own you, if it's a fleet owner or fleet operator, you're probably going to miss out an awful lot of the low-level near misses, because it's just seen as noise. If you are a member of an umbrella organization, you'll do even less of those. If it's very serious, you can see there at the top end, you will, by law, probably have to report it to a national regulator. And if it's something that really grips public interest, then everybody will know about it because of the media. But everything there that's covered in orange, that's wasted learning. We are not learning due to current reporting systems that are out there. And just to go through some of the consequences, these are ones you probably might be aware of. Certainly the first two you will be. So Townsend Torrison, 1987, 193 people killed. Why? Because they effectively took a shortcut that they had taken literally over and over again for years at a time. It was normal. It became new normal to leave the dock, head out to sea with the big gaping hole at the front of the vessel still actually open and not properly locked down. There's much more to it than that. It's gross oversimplification. But as a result of people not reporting a near miss, it became normal, and normal eventually killed somebody. And it's that old adage of, you get away with it until you don't. On the right-hand side, the big green, you can see there, the vessel, you can see how the hull cuts away underneath the what's called the rubbing strake, where that pilot ladder is hanging. The reason vessels have started having these V-shaped hulls is for sustainability, because it reduces the global emission, CO2 and other emissions, and makes the sort of miles per gallon, if you like, a lot better. The trouble is, you can't. They're literally unable physically to climb that ladder safely, because you can't rig a ladder against an overhang. You'll be swinging around, and that's because these vessels don't stay steady like that. They're normally bouncing around an awful lot. That water line where that door is in the side of the ship, for those that are interested, you can see those literally becoming awash, i.e. going underwater, and then within 5 to 6 seconds, that's probably 30, 40, 50 feet up in the air on these very large vessels. That's the sort of length, the amount of swing we're talking. So if you're trying to climb something that's literally dangling over the side like that, it's a hiding to nothing. Why has that been allowed to happen? Because pilots aren't reporting. Pilots don't report. Nobody's realized that you need to have a hull shape that needs to be flat, at least where you put the ladder. And so now we've got an awful lot of vessels out there, and you can't retrofit that. You can't build a thing on the side of the ship to make it flat. That vessel's going to be non-compliant probably the next 25, 50 years. And that's just how it is. To show that I'm not a one-trick pony, space shuttle disaster, 7 people dead, 4 billion costs, massive reputational blow. That was caused by O-ring failure. O-rings that were fitted in the booster rockets that their design envelope was that they worked until they went below freezing. And NASA had, on 5 previous occasions to this disaster, fired the rocket into space on a day following a very hard frost the night before. Therefore, as far as they were concerned, there wasn't an issue. So when people did say, hey, hang on a minute, we're outside the design envelope here, it was rejected out of hand. because they pointed back and went, well, it didn't happen the last 5 times. Nobody stopped to think, actually, it's not that it's safe because it didn't happen. Perhaps we just got away with it 5 times, and on the 6th time, unfortunately, they didn't. And on the right-hand side, bottom, you'll see that's what it looks like when you climb into an enclosed space. That's just a very small one. Sometimes those ladders can go down 30, 40 feet. And what happens, unfortunately, is people go into these things because they haven't ventilated properly, or they actually get ordered to not follow the procedures. The first guy goes in. It's normally a guy. 98% people at sea are men. They climb down the ladder. They take one breath of air, fall dead to the bottom. Their oppo sees them do exactly that. They don't realize that because human nature, you don't see a hazard. You can't see toxic air. It's not green like in the horror films. So they just see their friend fall down. So they step in because it's hardwired in us to go and help somebody in hazard. And within 2 to 3 seconds, the second person's a casualty. Worst one that I'm aware of is that it took until person number 7 dropped dead before person number 8 at the top went, hang on a minute, this isn't good. I'm not going down the ladder. That's how strong the urge to help people can be. Why? Because people aren't reporting these enough. And so, or they are reporting them, but what they're reporting is the fatalities, because you can't hide a body. Well, you can throw it over the side, but it's still, people ask questions. So if we're killing 7 people like that at a time, how many times beforehand has somebody gone into it and got away with it? And I'll give you an example of one that happened in the UK literally in the last 2 months. The safety officer of a ferry company, we don't name names, a ferry company was interested in selling one of its vessels, had 3 people from the company that wanted to buy them's management board, who weren't mariners, these were people that sat at C-suite level, came on board, and the selling company's safety manager, who should have known better, took them around the ship and went, oh, come and have a look in this compartment. Look how clean it is. Opened up the door of a closed space and stepped in. Now, very luckily, nobody died, but they were witnessed by a seafarer who had the courage to come to us. And they had to come to us because they said, look, if I write a report about seeing somebody step through the door, the first person who's going to read that is the person who stepped through the door, was the person who made the mistake. And if I go to them, I just know because of their character, I will get my P45 and I'll be sacked. But look, you can't just break the rules, especially if you're meant to be showing an example. So they came to us. We went to the company then took action and retrained this person and said, look, because we're not out to try and get anybody in trouble. We are out to try and save people's lives. And these are the sorts of consequences that occur because people don't learn. So why aren't we learning? For the reasons that I've mentioned. And unfortunately, we have to wait until literally things blow up in the air or ships sink or people fall dead in order to go, oh, yeah, we probably should have reported. And had people reported, those people would have been alive. And for each one of those people that have died, there's 150 people out there whose lives have now been blighted to one extent or another. I think that's me because even I get bored of my own voice after a while. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand you back. I hope that was helpful and useful. And I'm open to questions either now, or if you don't want to do it in an open forum like this, please do reach out, adam.parnell@chirp.co.uk.
Adam, thank you so much. I'm a little bit stunned by just how much of a problem there is out there. I think we all know that there is a degree of a problem, but seeing those figures, albeit impossible to get wholly accurate figures, they're still vast. And there is so much learning opportunity that's missed that that you just want to beg people to report. In fact, it reminds me of a case that I reported myself to CORESS, actually, whereby I had completed a consent form for the wrong side. And the registrar went to consent. The patient spotted it and just quietly tucked my consent form away and did a new one. Didn't tell me, but I'm a pretty nosy person, and I was looking through the records and found it and went, why didn't you tell me? I need to know. I don't think I'm a scary person, but maybe I was considered scary. But I'm like, that's a learning opportunity. And we've used it as a CORESS case example quite a few times now. just to say, talk about these near miss events. That was an easy near miss. Nobody came to any harm, but it was really valuable to talk about why it happened.
And these things are what, but a lot of it's cultural. In fact, it's all cultural. So, you know, there is, this sounds a bit cheesy. I think this is cheesy, but there are in Japanese car manufacturers on their sort of assembly lines, they always have a word for one of these things. So I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. It's Friday afternoon. But if somebody makes a mistake on the assembly line, the entire assembly line stops and then claps them. They clap them. They all sit there and go, well done, A, for telling us, and B, for now bringing to our attention a learning opportunity. So people are championed for pointing out where they've got things wrong. Now, you can just imagine that happening in the UK. You'd probably get a mouthful of abuse and told to sling your hook and not come back tomorrow. And so, you know, when we put people in, so what am I trying to say? Their culture champions it, and people therefore don't fear for all those hurdles that are raised about they're not going to lose their job. They're not going to be called stupid. I mean, the people might think it privately, and no doubt they felt a little bit abashed at the moment they raised it. But the fact was that assembly line isn't likely to suffer that issue again because they've all learned. Now, it's exceptionally naive to think that's going to happen in the maritime domain. I have no idea about the surgical domain, but you know, I guess there's a really good book if anybody's interested and they can't get to sleep, called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed. And in there, he I think explicitly talks about the surgical world and about the fact that I think he calls it like the superhuman complex. It's like as you climb the greasy pole of success, your reputation and your successes and your reputation become intrinsically linked, and therefore you almost can't ever make a mistake, you know, and therefore because the culture won't allow you to, and therefore you, even if you do make a mistake, you keep quiet about it rather than speak up because you think, hang on a minute. And this same company for organizations will not share data unless they're legally mandated to do so because they fear the reputational consequences, as opposed to thinking, okay, we'll share it, especially with an organization such as yourselves or us, where we don't name names. So it's like, look, if you tell us by the back door, we can tell others they can learn without knowing it was you. But there you go.
And that's exactly what CORESS tries to do. We've perhaps got time for one other question, but I'm mindful that we've had an excellent talk from Adam, and we don't want to take time from our other speakers. Doesn't seem that we've got any questions for you out in the open forum, Adam, but maybe people will reach out to you privately, and thank you for giving them the space to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. An excellent talk. So now we move on to a talk from Annie Hunnigher. Annie is a member of our advisory board, so we talk quite often. She's an anaesthetist. She's got a big interest in patient safety and is going to tell us about PSIRF. I like to think we've all heard of it already, but if you are unclear, then I'm hoping it will become clear to you after Annie's spoken. Thank you so much, Annie. Over to you.
Thank you, Harriet. Right, let's just, can you see my slides? Oh.
Yes, we can, yeah.
Sorry, something's happened here. Hello everyone, I'm Annie Hunnigher, and I'm going to tell you a bit about PSIRF, the new Patient Safety Incident Response Framework, and how it's going in practice. I'm a consultant in anaesthesia, but I'm Group Safety Lead at Barts Health, and I'm also a patient safety specialist, which I'll tell you a bit about, but I'm also a quality improvement coach, and it kind of brings together some of those things in the talk, and really it goes really well with the talk we've just heard about maritime, I think. So the NHS patient safety strategy was launched in 2019, and this is what it looks like, with a really kind of bold vision around safer culture, safer systems, safer patients. But it has these three things, the three I's: insight, so, you know, measurement, understanding our incidents, you know, litigation alerts, having really good insight of what's going on, involving our people, our staff, and our patients in particular. I'll tell you a bit more about patient safety partners in a minute, but ultimately getting improvement and seeing those actual improvements. And so this is a slide we created at Barts, how to sort of explain what's changing. And so there's a lot of change in language, and there's a lot of change in the approach. So the names change, so we don't talk about SIs anymore, or the serious incident framework. We talk about PSIRF and patient safety incident responses. It's a bit of a change in language from reporting to response, and using a variety of tools to learn. And these tools, I'm going to show you a few later, really have human factors and QI methodology at their core. In the past, I know when I was first appointed as a consultant, I was tapped on the shoulder, will you investigate this incident? I'd had no training at all. And now there's an expectation that learning response leads will have be highly trained and understand systems, models, and human factors. How do we share safety learning and communicate messages? You know, the sort of email of a slide pack is maybe not as effective as other ways of creating plans, doing thematic analysis, anticipating what might be coming, and getting that system change. So this is what trusts are expected to do. And then the patient, family, and staff involvement with the serious incident framework was quite variable, and now it's absolutely core to PSIRF that we involve people in the solutions, the learning, and the quality improvement. So I've been doing quite a lot of training on this at my trust, and one of the sessions we do is around, we look at different films and sort of try and liken them to PSIRF. One of the films is Let It Go, because actually when you get into the serious incident framework, most people say it isn't very good. I mean, we see the same incidents happening again and again and again because the system doesn't change, and we don't set ourselves goals that are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. I'll talk a bit more about SMART goals later. So we're hoping that this is an improvement, and this is an improvement project in itself, so we need to also measure. So the 4 key principles of PSIRF are firstly this compassionate engagement of involving people, and just restorative culture, you know, listening to them and involving them and recognizing that patients are harmed, but our staff are harmed too. Also proportionate responses. So often we've kind of run around doing a lot of work around a never event that didn't, for example, that didn't cause any harm, and yet there's a really harmful incident that's occurred and no one's paying any attention to that. So we need to be proportionate in where we put our resources, particularly, you know, with the system under so much pressure. We need to strengthen the response systems in organisations so that we learn across specialties and across those boundaries that exist between different hospital sites, and really focus on what's improved and what's sustained. And we need to think differently. We've often thought in the past in quite a linear way of a sort of system. So we need to move more to system-based thinking, which I'm going to talk a bit more about. There are 2 new roles I just wanted to mention, because I will mention them in the talk and you'll be like, what's she talking about? But patient safety specialists, if you look up on NHS England, there's a lot of information around that. There's about 800 patient safety specialists appointed nationally, and we're in a programme with Loughborough doing a patient safety certificate. And within the patient safety strategies, there's different levels. So level 1 and 2 safety is on the e-learning for health, but this takes us up to 3 and 4. And I've learnt so much doing it, but also have a really valuable network, and we share resources and talks and ideas. Also is the patient safety partner, who's a professional patient who is paid for the role, who will come on committees, come to improvement work, and be that critical friend and give a patient voice. So then they're much more than a volunteer, and they're not, you know, a patient that's got a sort of axe to grind that comes along. They bring specific skills and hold us to account and provide the critical friend challenge, as it's called. And what I've found actually is the patient safety partners, for those of us trying to improve safety, are our allies that absolutely got our back and really work very collaboratively with them. And it's been a great pleasure to have them on board. One of the key things around PSIRF is truly trying to understand work as done, WAD. So often we've looked at data around compliance, you know, how we're judging work, how we're measuring safety, but it's meaningless. And what we really need to do is get in and understand how people are doing their work, how we can help them to be safer, what they're doing that is superfluous. There's a lot of extra layers put onto us that isn't actually improving safety. It's just you know, more bureaucracy, and we've all seen that. So we've started over many years been doing sort of safety visits, which are like coaching in situ, but I'm now calling them work as done visits, to really work with teams to understand how they do their work and understand what are the barriers. And this is a real sort of human factors way of thinking that we need to really bring in. Within PSIRF, this is the main model that we use in every learning response, and this is called the SEIPS model, the Systems Engineering Initiative for Patient Safety. What it recognises is the complexity of the system we work in, and so often we've focused on the person or the people in the system without recognising the interplay with organisational factors, with technology and tools, with the tasks we're being asked, with the environment, and how this impacts on safety. So central to a lot of the work I'm doing is this would be probably the first tool that I would use. So there are different learning responses, and they're really graded on a timeline. So let's say in theatre we had a fall from the table. The first response that you would hope would happen would be a swarm huddle, where the whole team comes round and uses a template that we've created one, but other trusts will have created one to understand the how, not the who, the how, and they would look at that SEIPS model and work out what's going on. And so this are the different types of responses, and these happen in kind of time order, or can happen concurrently, and you don't have to use one response, you could use more than one response. So the swarm huddle happens in the moment. The after action review usually happens after a couple of days. An MDT review may fall out of those two kind of responses that people say, we need to get the whole MDT together and discuss it. Horizon scanning is about thinking about what's happening nationally and internationally that could affect your risk and safety. Thematic analysis is about, you know, putting together incidents and theming the issues, which is what we do at CORESS as well. What are the big issues? And then to replace the sort of serious incident framework sort of report is the patient safety incident investigation, which is called a PSII, which is a sort of longer report type thing. And then we have safety improvement planning, which I'll come into, and I've mentioned about safety visits, coaching, work as done. So on our templates for these responses, this is the sort of thing you'd find in the template, this SEIPS model again, dividing the barriers and facilitators into those sections that are in the systems model. And so we're not talking about root cause, because there isn't a root cause. This is a system, and there's lots of things to consider. And we also, in safety now, really want to consider safety one, which are the sort of possible causes, but also what went well and what can we learn from, and where might this be, where can we learn from excellence? And so trying to get that balance, because so often we've gone for the sort of find and fix safety one type approach. So I'm going to bring a case that we discussed earlier to the fore to give you an example. This is a woman who had a thyroid operation, had a post-thyroid bleed. I was on call and was called to the bedside to find this situation. I won't go into the specifics of the case, but it was really harrowing and difficult. We managed to, have permissions for the photos. We managed to intubate her. We managed to use the scoop protocol and get the wound open, and she survived. So it's a really good one to learn from. But as part of this work, we then put it into the SEIPS model. And we discussed this at CORESS as well, because often, you know, the solutions to how to improve the care in this sort of case and ensure that everyone's using scoop are there's so many facets to it. And if you divide it using the systems model, you can see that you get a really good understanding of how you could change the system and get the learning really embedded in so many ways that next time I'm on call and there's a post-thyroid bleed, things would happen in a much more timely manner in the way as intended in the scoop protocol. And this, at the end of our templates, is where we start doing this safety improvement plan. And anyone trained in QI or used QI will know we really like to set SMART objectives: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And so often in the past, if you look at SI reports, it says, you know, train the MDT in human factors. It doesn't say who, by when, you know, and so on. So we set SMART aims that then we can say, yes, we've done that, and then we can move on and train more. But we set ourselves realistic goals. And so that's the sort of SMART thing. And in a lot of our work, that's what we need to do. We've set very vague goals that are never achievable and don't really pin down the issues and help us learn for improvement. This is our model for improvement that we use at Barts Health. And so it's this, you know, getting stakeholders and the MDT around the issue, understanding your system by using some of these tools to diagnose, developing an aim, and then measuring and testing and implementing, and that way you actually get change that a year on you can see this has actually changed. So within PSIRF there are national priorities and local priorities, and I just wanted to mention this. So at a trust level, they will have defined their national priority, they will know the national priorities, and they will define local priorities based on their governments and local incidents and risks. So I just wanted to give you an example. So let's say we take pressure ulcers, which is a harm that occurs across the UK. Then we would then create a driver diagram, which is what we use in quality improvement, with a really smart aim there to reduce the number of grade 2 pressure ulcers at the Royal London by 30% by 2024. So you can see it's a really specific age, and then break it down and then measure and then try different things and see what causes the reduction in the pressure ulcers. Now, I know this isn't necessarily that relevant to surgery, but if you think about surgery and think about how we can apply it to PSIRF, what we might need to do is think, what are the priorities in surgery for safety, and put our resources into that. And that's a kind of PSIRF way of approaching something. Now, I chair the NCIP committee at Barts Health, and this is what we've tried to do to get better insights. I'm just giving an example that I hope will resonate with you. So to get better insight, we've created Datex categories, which enabled us to see, based on all of our incidents reported related to invasive safety, what are the big issues. So you can see that the biggest thing that's being reported is around implants. Now, I'm sorry this isn't that easy to read, that's why I've put on the arrows. So implants are the biggest issue. The little orange line shows the harm. So this shows the harm to incident ratio. So I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. But so you can see, so if we're going to do something around invasive safety, it makes sense that we start putting our work into implants, because there's clearly a lot of reporting related to implants across our surgical services. The second one is reporting around governance processes within the surgery division. And then you can see there that actually the harm level is much higher, which is a bit of a red flag. So it may be that even though it's slightly less in number, that more harm's being occurred. So we need to kind of prioritize where we put in our time. And so I'm just showing you, so consent was then the third. You can see site marking and induction are further along, but actually the harm levels are higher. So because incident reporting numbers in themselves are difficult to interpret, because in a good culture you'll have a higher reporting rate, but actually what you want is a low harm rate. So it's starting to apply these principles to surgery and then use it to put our resources and then measure around those priorities. The other tool that I've been using with PSIRF is, again, this is a prioritization tool where you take, you know, for this thyroid case, okay, these are some of the actions that have been identified, and then assess them on inequality, feasibility, acceptability, cost benefit, effectiveness and sustainability, and then put your resources into the ones with the highest score, because actually achieving all these actions is very challenging. So put your time into where you think you'll have the most benefit. So there are a number of tools that we use in QI and safety that are actually quite similar, and that's the other thing that I've been trying to do, is really demystify the tools. So in QI we do process mapping, and in safety and human factors we do task analysis. It's pretty similar. It's just breaking down what you do. So let's say with a scoop pack, when the patient completes surgery and goes out to recovery, what are the process steps that mean that that scoop pack's with them, and then the wound would be opened if necessary, for example. Pareto analysis is what we've just seen, sort of putting our effort in to where we can have the most impact. A QI tool is the 5 whys, where you just keep asking why, and safety is one called so what if. So, so what if there wasn't a scoop pack in recovery, for example, what happens then? Well, the patient bleeds, we can't open the wound. So it's sort of looking at it like that. The fishbone kind of cause and effect is a bit like the CEIPS model, understanding all the contributory causes, and another tool that we use, which is an axiomat, which is sort of mapping out how things fit together. One we use in QI is force fields analysis. So what are the driving forces for change? What are the restraining forces? In QI, they talk about the Gemba walk, go see. So this is a lesson in leadership, to go and see what's going on. Don't assess it from compliance data. And we've talked about this, what work has done. And in QI, they talk about appreciative inquiry, and in safety, learning from excellence. The concepts, I think, are really similar. So it's sort of taking these concepts into the work, that we're really trying to understand the how, not the who. So using these new responses and tools, we're hoping to get much richer actions. We're involving the MDTs, we're setting priorities that will enable us to get impact, and that sustainment of improvements. And so the actual outcome measures that we're looking at are actual improvement in the domains. So at trust level, let's say pressure ulcers, showing actual improvement, as you saw on those graphs. And in surgery, can we show improvement in how implants are used? And there are a number of measures that we'd use in addition to the incidents to understand that. What is the staff experience of being involved in a safety event or incident? What's their qualitative experience? Did they feel involved? Were they listened to? And what's the patient experience? Okay, so this course that we'd developed called PSIRF in Practice is a half-day course which goes through all of this, and we actually won the prize at Patient Safety Congress, so that was really great. But with that, it's again getting the education is really getting people involved. So we do kind of swarm huddle role plays, and within the role play, those elements of the CEIPS come out. And we do an after action review practice, and we talk about the different tools you might use. And people really love this course because it really demystifies it, and it means they'll go forth and say, okay, let's do a swarm. Something happened on the list today, let's do a swarm, let's learn about it, let's discuss it. And then the learning is shared. So it sounds like similar to what the previous speaker was saying about learning live, quick learning. And it's much more efficient and happens in a more timely manner. The other course that I've been doing is called Candle, which is Curriculum and Delivery Learning Event, and recognising that our residents, as they're now called, but our trainees have all got to do quality improvement projects or safety projects, and we need to give them the tools and give them the teams that enable them to do this. And so doing a sort of supported place-based project, and sort of they are the engine of the hospital, and getting them involved in getting some of these improvements over the line. And so in anaesthesia, the curriculum's changed a lot to include all this, and I understand from conversations I've had a similar in surgery, and there's various papers that I've seen in surgical improvement, what makes a project actually lead to improvement, and it is having the team, setting an aim, using the tools, and really making an improvement that people feel is of benefit. And then I've done a lot of safety team training, and again bringing some of this to our MDTs who are very keen to learn as a team and understand the sort of systems thinking. So just a last word on language. With PSIRF, our language has changed a lot. You know, it's more about responding, not necessarily the report. We want to see an actual response. It's about support and restoration, not blame. It's about systems and action and not linear thinking or root cause. Often I see, oh, this incident's been closed, but there's not been the improvement. It's about real improvement. As I've said, it's the who, it's the how, not the who. It's about measurement for improvement and not compliance. It's about co-creation with patients and staff and not commissioning. It's about getting actual action to implement and not lots of email packs that don't really result in change. And it's about fixing the system, not the people. And so I hope for those of you who knew something about PSIRF, this has brought some ideas and things to discuss. I hope that if you didn't know anything about PSIRF, you know a bit more about it. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Annie. Fantastic talk, and that's definitely helped clarify things for me. You reminded me of that heart sink feeling you have when you see an old style RCA report where there's an unachievable aim, where they haven't actually asked the team if they can actually achieve that, you know, a weekly huddle or a weekly meeting or something like that. And you're like, you can't ask us to do that and make that an outcome without actually talking through it with the team involved. So making it pertinent and quick learning live. I love that one as well. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Annie? She's put her contact details there, so I'm sure if you haven't got questions to ask now, you'll be able to reach out to Annie through other routes. Annie, thank you so much. Excellent talk and really good to learn more about PSIRF. And now we will move on. Running a little bit late, but I don't think that's a bad thing because the talks have been excellent. I'd love to introduce now my colleague, Professor Simon Kenny. He works with me at Alder Hey, but he's not going to be talking about Alder Hey. This is about a talk related to his national role as National Clinical Director. Simon, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. And I'm going to hand over the screen and so on to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harriet, and thanks for inviting me to this. I'm sort of, in presenting this, it's a bit of a journey about where we're going with data. I think it's taking a different view of the same issue, and there are no absolute answers around what I'm going to talk about. I think hopefully it will raise some thoughts about where we might go with this. But, you know, and I also think that as I talk through this, language is really important, and I don't think we've necessarily quite got our language right. And I'm a paediatric surgeon at Alder Hey Children's Hospital. I work with and for Harriet, and also I'm National Clinical Director for Children. But since 2016, I've been the GIRFT clinical lead for children for paediatric surgery. And from 2018 onwards, was one of the first clinicians involved in developing the NCIP portal, which we'll come on to. I'm going to talk about children's surgery because it's, I think, but what I'm going to talk about is pertinent to all aspects of clinical practice, really. And ultimately, when we're talking about safety, when we're talking about what our daily job is, it's about creating a quality experience. And this, for me, is for children's surgery, is having a good child and family experience, good recovery from disease, great functional result, low complication rate, and value for money, and the entire population treated equitably. And data plays a really big role in that. And within children's surgery, we've been on a journey with this. We started off in 2006 with BAPS-CAS, which was a paper-based audit, which was very heavily bureaucratic. Surgical departments across the country filled with bits of paper. Here's some examples of them that basically started to pull data together about to get a baseline. And actually, although it was clunky, and at the times carrier pigeons were involved in taking these bits of paper and moving them back to Oxford where we did the analysis, what it did do is it set a benchmark, which was actually a global benchmark, the first time in the world that we could see on a population basis what the outcomes were for these conditions. Now, as someone who's heavily involved in this, it didn't escape my knowledge and others that there were probably better ways of doing this, and we are in a moment of major technological change. But these were landmark studies. And the NHS is incredibly powerful. I think there's an economic value to this. I think it's been estimated at several £billion a year. The fact that the NHS has such strong data linkages. But at its core, we've got a patient who's got an NHS number, we've got a doctor who's got a GMC number. And there's also multiple data sets that we can link to that. At its most basic, we've got hospital episode statistics data. That gives us around about 20 diagnostic fields and about 14 procedural fields for each episode of care. But also increasingly, we're starting to be able to track implanted devices. We can look at costs of care. We can actually link through to primary care data and public health data, and that allows us to see whole pathways of care for people, not just seeing the patient as they turn up in our clinic or in our hospital, but getting insights into the journey that they've had before. So I've sort of been involved with starting to look at how we can use routine data since my starting as as I was a trainee in paediatric surgery in the 1990s, and it's been a sort of lifelong work to get to where we are now. And when the Getting It Right First Time programme came into being, I was pleased to see that paediatric surgery was one of the first 8 specialties that was involved. And now there's 65 different clinical specialties which use Getting It Right First Time. And this is where the first sort of issue with semantics and patient safety, I think, starts to rise, which is that sort of setting that impossibly high bar of getting it right first time. And it's, as a practicing surgeon, I have this sinking feeling as I have a patient where I've definitely not got it right first time, and evidence, and I feel like imposter syndrome as I then go out and start to proselytize about the right thing that should be done. But at its core, the strength of the GIRF program is using data to illustrate, to put a mirror up to providers around how services are doing, and mapping that with expert clinical review. And if we're, I think the Black Swan book, which Adam mentioned, is a great one, but another one is The Art of Humble Inquiry. And at its heart, I think that's where GIRF works best, is if you show people data and say, does this represent what you see? And on the back of that, produced a specialty report in 2021. And on the right, I'm just showing some slides, the sort of data that we were able to produce at a provider level at that point.
Yeah.
Geographic mapping. Kishore, do you mind? Yep, thanks. Just muting your phone. Thank you. The findings from that are very broad, but essentially we found that expertise was spread too thinly. There was an unequal system for preterm infants, where some babies get access to paediatric surgeons and others don't. We saw major issues with the care for children with appendicitis and delays in surgery for boys with torsion, and a worryingly patchy adoption of evidence-based surgery, which was leading to unnecessary surgery and unwarranted variation in volumes of surgery, with obviously clearly different standards, different gateway criteria being used before children were subjected to surgery. And sitting underneath it all is a poor child experience. Now, what's happened since then is the GIRF data sets that we started to build in 2016, it was pretty manual. And then a model health system came into being. For those of you who don't access this, any clinician or any person working in the NHS can get a user account into what has become an incredibly large data repository about NHS activity. It's moved from hospital to system because it looks at ICB level and operational delivery network now. But when you log in, you can start to see on a provider level where you stand. This is an example of the paediatric surgery stuff. I'm looking at umbilical hernia, rather boring umbilical hernias, but essentially you shouldn't be operating on anyone under the age of 3. And in this data, you can see it as a provider. Are you doing that or aren't you? And that can start to generate discussions about what you're doing and where you're doing it. An example of this is circumcision. Academy of Medical Royal Colleges say that really the indications for therapeutic circumcision, I'm not talking about religious circumcision, in children age 16 are few and far between. I did actually write this guidance, so I am a bit biased, but they did accept it. This sort of shows on a provider level the variation for children, of the numbers of children receiving therapeutic circumcision across the NHS, and each column is a provider, the y-axis is volume. Surprising to me is that we see on the far right some of the major providers of children's circumcision are quite small district general hospitals, which show that there's unnecessary practice occurring in there. Just to show the benefit of seeing this data on a national scale and starting to have those conversations about unnecessary surgery. This shows the x-axis here is from 2018 to now, and the black line is the national median number of circumcisions being done. And you can see that actually we've halved the number of medical circumcisions by starting to have that conversation at provider level. So this shows that you can start to drive change, and you can see via funnel plots, and this is an example of funnel plot. Each dot represents a provider. The dotted lines, the outermost dotted line is the 99.8 confidence interval. So you can start to identify providers where there's unusual practice taking place. And this is for children being circumcised under the age of 5, where the indications are really small. So this allows us to start those discussions, which is hopefully in a mutually respectful way, to start to drive change. And I think you can see that we've done it. We've also got sitting in there to a certain extent is some outcome data. So mortality we can report on, and we can also look at things like emergency readmission rates and lengths of stay, but the repertoire is necessarily small. But what about surgeon level outcome data, and where does that play into, and what does it mean in terms of safety? We've got situations such as Ian Patterson, where you could see more than 1,000 patients have needless operations. We've got the vaginal mesh story, which is that the NHS introduced surgery with all best intent, but didn't really have the ability to track that procedure. And I would contend that if we were able to use current methodologies, we'll be able to track new procedures and realise the complications much earlier, rather than having to wait for the significant patient harm which has occurred. So in 2018, the then Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt convened the National Consultant Information Programme under the auspices of Sir Norman Williams, ex-president of the Royal College of Surgeons. And essentially what this was doing was starting to pull the kind of data that we've seen in GIRFT reports and putting it into consultant practice. This has necessarily been a process which has been done incredibly carefully. It's been done with involving both the Royal College of Surgeons and all surgical specialty associations as we started to build it. So it's been the profession and the NHS standing shoulder to shoulder in terms of starting to show this data. And it started off with restricted access to 4 user groups. At first, it was consultant surgeons and responsible officers. That has been expanded recently to include trust specialty leads and medical directors as well, so that there's a broader oversight of each surgeon's data. At the moment, the primary data source is hospital episode statistics, but I think that is just the start, as we'll discuss shortly. And it shows the volume of activity across all providers for a range of surgical procedures. So when you look at the data, and you'll see it shortly, you can see where you sit relative to others. The quality metrics, as I've mentioned, are fairly basic at the moment in mortality and emergency readmissions. But the real strength of this is that the data is presented at consultant clinician level, but also at that level, the clinician is able to then link to pseudonymized patient records, so they can start to interrogate the data. So that if there's concerns about data quality, they can be involved in that process. And it's shortly you're going to be able to see the NHS number within that, not at the moment, but it's essentially it's a real strength of this, that you can get down to that level. And it also allows, it doesn't risk adjust for individual cases, but what it does do is that it allows you to see how your population may differ compared to others, for instance, with deprivation indices, etc. And the intent in fullness of time is to risk adjust more than we're doing now. It's 130 trusts have enrolled. It's quite a big information governance process to get through this. And there's 15 participating surgical specialties, of which 8 are currently being prioritised. And we've got 414 procedure dashboards across 15 specialties and over 4,000 users. This is just a quick shot of what's present for paediatric surgery. And if you're doing these cases and you log into NCIP, you will see your outcomes for these procedures. So you can see that there's a wide range of activity. And what became obvious to us within NCIP is that at one side, it's an IT project. At another side, it's actually a project which involves marketing. So getting people to start to use it, trying to make the process of access to this data as easy as possible, and packaging it in such a way that the ergonomics of using it are intelligible. So we've worked very hard at how that interface works, and can export it for the use within appraisal. Now I've managed to delete the slides, which actually shows what it looks like, but essentially you can see funnel plots, which and for each condition you can export a data pack which explains how you're doing with regards to that procedure and benchmarks to your colleagues. Now, that then starts to raise issues around outlier status and what that means, and the language then becomes very important, because it could become a stick rather than a carrot and something for reflective practice, and that's certainly not the intent of the NCIP team. But ultimately, and you could see with the cases that I mentioned, that there may be situations where outlier status means that there is a serious problem. So we're still in that process of working through a policy about how to manage from a medical director, responsible officer, and clinical director, an individual role, how those outlier status is managed. And sitting underneath that will be things like incident reporting. And I think one of the interesting things will be to see, if I was at medical director level now, to see how many procedures that NCIP was picking up to cross-check and make sure that they are going through and the maximum learning is being made out of them. That's the sort of stick bit. I think the quality improvement bit from this is that the overwhelming feedback I've got from consultant surgeons who are using it is that it provides them with an incredibly large amount of reassurance about their practice, because when things go wrong, it's very easy and we all, for every 20 thoughts we have, we think 19 bad thoughts and we think 1 good thought. And it's very easy to sort of focus on the bad things. And sometimes, and I think we all do as clinicians, have weeks or days where everything you touch falls apart and you start to think, why am I doing this? I know from my perspective, and I know from others, that what they found that this is particularly important in is reinforcing the fact that rather than looking at the last case, it allows you to look at your last 100, and you can see that actually you're doing a good job. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful things. And I hope that it provides that supportive culture to clinicians to help them report things when things go wrong, so that the maximum learning can be developed. So I like to think in giving this talk, it comes from a different angle. It comes from a data-driven angle, but I think it's incredibly complementary with what's been talked about already with regards to the Maritime experience and also about PSIRF, which is a great program. Now, just finally, very briefly, we're moving on from this, and currently we are now live with the Children's Surgery Outcome Research Database. And this goes a step further. This is just an example of what are pretty dreadful outcomes for children with Hirschsprung's disease. None of these are very easy to measure apart from mortality using standard data. So essentially we are now live with this system, and it takes 3 parts of it. There's a central database we've got these hospitals across the country participating in this. But essentially, when you've got an index procedure, the electronic patient record, as you're filling in that patient record, it's actually populating the Seesaw database with much richer data that we can get from routinely collected data. That's combined with the HES data that I've already shown you within GIRFT and NCIP. And particularly powerfully, it's also combined with core outcome data, and that's available by, for instance, looking at continence levels, etc., through a parent portal. And at the time of a baby having surgery, there is a digital means of recruitment so the child can be followed up until their 16th birthday. And then at that point, the child will then be re-recruited into a long-term outcome study. We think that this is the basis for outcome reporting across NHS systems, actually, by doing this. But sitting on top of that, we're also putting in statistical processing to look at, and we've worked with parents and clinicians to look at what a good outcome means. And in children's surgery, the numbers are so small, we have to pool different procedures. So we have to pool, for instance, esophageal atresia, diaphragmatic hernia, and Hirschsprung's disease to get a unit level score. So we've been through that, worked with mathematicians in Oxford University, and have published on this treatment success score and look at the observed versus the predicted outcome score. And this is going to allow us to compare neonatal surgical units across the country to see whether they are matching whether expected or not, and then to start a discussion around what is it that makes you particularly good at doing something, or what can we learn from other units that might mean you can improve your outcomes. So I hope that's been thought-provoking. It's quite different, but it's the same problem from a different angle, I think. And very keen to make sure that as we do this, we don't create a culture of fear or despondency, but create a permissive culture that allows us to learn from when things go wrong, but feel supported at the same time.
Thank you so much, Simon. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to work with you. I've been on the journey with you to a small degree, in that we've often been the people that have looked at your systems before they've gone live. And I feel very privileged to be able to do that. I can certainly say that NCIP is really valuable to look at your data. So please do go and look at it if you have access to that as a consultant. It really helps you know that outcome that you thought you were not great at, it may or may not be as bad as you thought. And if it is, then you've got the opportunity to do something about it. The Cecil project, that's really exciting, brand new, but I think will be really valuable in the future. Does anybody have any questions for Simon? I appreciate that you've got to go, Adam. Don't worry about that. Really appreciate your time. Any questions for Simon? Okay, doesn't seem so. Simon, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today, and keep it up. There's so much more to come from your project. I know that for sure, from all the work that you're doing. Not a project, that's not quite the right word, is it? Much bigger than that. So that brings us on now to our fourth and final speaker, who is David Locke. David is a lawyer with Hull Dickinson. I've worked with David for some time, as I had the role of being consent lead for our trust, and David was a massive help to me in that role, having started the post with no knowledge at all. He held my hand through that journey, and hopefully we've improved the consent process in our hospital to some degree, perhaps not to perfection, I fear, but at least better than it was. David's going to talk to us a little bit about consent, because it's always important, but he's going to touch on his experience of AI as well, and that's something that really will be new to me. So over to you now, David. I will now share your slides.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's really great to be able to speak to people who are self-evidently passionate about learning and changing and driving forward improvements, because that's something I'm really passionate about. I've been doing my job for about 20 years now, and there's nothing more frustrating than seeing the same claims come through, the same mistakes. I really do sometimes wonder if we just fail um, to make use of the data that's at our fingertips to really make a difference to the patients that come through the door. Which brings me to consent, which is something I've been talking about now for 7 or 8 years, probably having done hundreds, maybe even 120 seminars, to try and help the NHS get to grips with an issue about which I think there's a lot of confusion. And I'm not sure I've done a very good job because the claims are still coming through. And in that context, we're kind of moving forward to this brand new era of artificial intelligence, and bringing informed consent into that arena is going to be another challenge. Well, it's a worry to me because if we haven't met the first challenge of getting informed consent right with the way things are right now, how are we gonna do it as we go into the future? We look at the next slide. It's
I'm just struggling to get my slides to move because I've lost my mouse.
I can talk anyway.
And the arrows are not working, so just bear with me.
Don't worry, I can rattle on. I set myself 3 objectives for today, which is a bit ambitious with a 20-minute talk. But the slide that we can't see has got 3 bullet points on. Informed consent, why don't we get it yet? It is what I want to talk about first. Then artificial intelligence, and then bring them together, consent for AI-led treatment. I'm going to recap just very briefly the position on consent, and then tell you the statistics which trouble me. So we moved from the Bolam test to the Montgomery test. That's great. Can we move on another slide as well? Yeah, thank you. So this was the historical situation that those of you who are involved in clinical negligence work will appreciate. So it's a great statement of medical paternalism. A doctor's not guilty of negligence if they acted in accordance with a body that was accepted as proper by a reasonable body of medical practitioners skilled in that particular art. So what that means in the context of consent is, let's say a decision was taken not to explain a particular risk to a patient. So long as you could point to another responsible body of practice which also wouldn't have warned about that particular risk, you were fine. So very much the doctors as the gatekeeper of knowledge. If we move on to the next slide, please. And we can skip that and move on again. So this is a challenge that I always set whenever I give this talk, and obviously my standard lecture is much longer. The test I'm going to come on to talk about, in many respects, had already been captured in a lot of the regulatory statements that have been issued over quite a long period of time. I'm just going to focus on this, but they go back much earlier than 2013. So the requirement is to work in partnership with patients, listen to and respond to their concerns and preferences, give them the information they want or need in a way they can understand, and respect their right to reach decisions. And the reason why it says in red there, does anyone disagree, is because when I give my larger lectures, I say to the whole audience, does anybody disagree? And nobody ever puts their hand up. And that's great because I think this is a fundamental statement that everybody should agree on. But then I say this, I say, as I carry on with my presentation, you're going to start thinking up justifications and reasons not to tell patients about this, that, or the other to do with their treatment. And it always happens, and people will put their hand up and say, well, what about this? What about that? And I just skip back through my slides to this slide. I throw the question back to them, how is what you're saying consistent with that statement with which you didn't disagree? That's always very troubling to them. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I won't say very much about this case because we don't have time, but it changed the framework for how we look at consent. So it's no longer possible to defend a case simply by referring to another body of responsible practitioners. There's now a very specific test that has to be complied with. Can we jump forward a slide, please? Yeah, that's the perfect one. So it's set out there, and obviously you'll get these slides and you can take them away. But we changed from medical paternalism to a real obligation to provide patients with information and simply guide them to a decision rather than withholding information and effectively making the decision for them. So the test is underlined there. Patient needs to know any material risks, any alternative treatments. And when you're thinking about a material risk, you have to think about it in an objective and a subjective way. So what would be significant to a body of patients undergoing that particular treatment? And then whether there is anything specific about that patient that means something else should be discussed with them. And I want to explain what I mean by that, because the subjective element of the test is being overlooked every single day in NHS practice. If you had a patient, if you were an ophthalmic surgeon, and you had a patient who was blind in one eye, and you were proposing to operate on their remaining eye, their good eye, that is a very different situation to a patient with two good eyes. Suddenly, a risk of permanent paralysis of the good eye or of blindness in the good eye, it becomes much more significant because that's complete blindness, not blindness in one eye. So this is an example of where subjective assessment of patients is very, very important, and that was a real case. If we can just move on, please. And I know I'm going at pace, but it's necessary for the time that we've got. I've given you the example. Yeah, there's nothing else I need to say about that. Let's move on again. Here's a case study that's going to take us through to a discussion about AI, and I want to give you an example. There's two. So here, a surgeon failed to advise that a proposed procedure was new and that there was an alternative available. That's a very clear failure of consent. Let me put some flesh on the bones of that and give you another example. In Newcastle, a patient is undergoing or is going to undergo replacement of a heart valve. The success rate using a conventional surgical approach is about 97%. But somehow that patient is consented for a robotic assisted surgery and dies on the operating table. The surgeon had undertaken four goes training before undertaking the live surgery, one on a cadaver and three in an AI environment effectively. I wonder, and we'll come back to this, what does that consent discussion look like? What information do you have to impart to a patient in a circumstance like that to persuade them from having an operation with a 97% chance of success to an operation that you've undertaken in the broadest sense on only 4 occasions. Let's park that, but it's an important point we're going to come back to. Next slide, please. And as I race through that recap of consent, and some of you may have heard my wider lecture, it's to get to this. The rate of increase of other clinical negligence claims is steady. Consent cases are increasing 4 times as fast, with a 10-fold increase in claims where consent is an ancillary issue. There are a couple of explanations for that potentially. One is that the Montgomery case highlighted for claimants an avenue to get to damages. The other, and we have to face this and confront it and accept that it may be the explanation, is that we're not getting informed consent rights still, despite the 100 or so sessions that I've done, all the internal work that you guys have done and that's been done at other trusts. We're not getting it right. We're failing to move from the paternalistic model to applying the obligations of Montgomery. I'd be very interested to know if anybody's got any thoughts on that. I know a huge amount of work has been done, but there's the evidence, and I'm seeing it every single day. Can we jump on that slide? Just a very, very brief word about this. You guys all here at the forefront of consent, as far as I'm concerned. As Harriet said, we did a great deal. We did a great deal of work, and I know a great deal of work went on in relation to electronic consent. Here's just a point to remember. I mentioned the subjective test. Electronic consent and pre-generated forms are very good for an objective approach, but we have to make sure we've inbuilt and baked into our systems the ability to record subjective issues and to demonstrate that they've been addressed and dealt with. Reliance on electronic systems to guide us is useful, and it's important, but it can lead to a tick box approach to consent that we really can't afford to have. I have a great example of that, but I probably don't have time to give it, but I may come back to it later on. Can we move on, please? Okay, so this is what I'm currently very, very interested in. And there's a sensible way to have the discussion, and then there's this picture of a Terminator. There are people out there who are absolutely convinced that AI is gonna end the world, and you know, we're going to end up in some kind of science fiction situation. I'm not going to talk about that. There's a lot of steps on the way. But some of those steps need very, very serious consideration, and there's a lot of thought that needs to go into how AI is integrated into the NHS. Can we move on, please? I've done a lot of writing about AI, and what I feel is important, and perhaps you agree, is that people have an understanding of its essence. What it is at its core. And the reason for that is, and this is ultimately going to be the experience of the NHS, there is a lot of money to be made in AI. There are a lot of vested interests. A lot of the literature gives one side of the story and one side of the story only. So let us, in order to evaluate what people are saying, let us understand what AI is. It is designed to do something better than the way it is being done now. Okay. That sounds very simple, very straightforward. Well, what do we mean by better? The problem we've got then is you have to look at who's doing this evaluation. Better could be quicker, it could be more efficiently, it could be more accurately. Um, it could also be cheaper. And in a situation where we have our trusts in this country perpetually working at a deficit, perpetually underfunded, there's a real danger that the financial um, definition of better becomes um, rather more dominant than we would like it to be. And also better than whom? There's a number of ethical questions that have to be answered with AI. Better than whom? Well, in the vast majority of circumstances, um, the tasks with which AI is concerned are being undertaken by us, by humans. So it's better than us. That may or may not be a concern. Technology always advances, and inevitably it leads to a reducing the need for a human workforce. It's ever been thus. But what are the implications for the NHS there? Let me give you an example. And again, very interested if you agree, very interested if you've got other ideas. If we have a developing situation where AI is being used, let's say, to review histopathology, um, and it does it very, very well. How long before trainees start thinking, well, that's not an area of medicine that I want to go into, because what's the point? They don't need me. They've got AI. Okay. Time goes by, 10 years go by, and this is pretty much an AI-led service now. There's not many doctors working there. Well, what happens if the AI goes down, which is entirely plausible? What happens if a new modality of scanning or a new staining tool or some new methodology is designed? Um, the AI can't use that because AI is trained with reference to what's happened in the past. With histopathology, maybe it's seen 10,000, 20,000 um, previous slides and diagnoses, and effectively what it does is play snap. It looks at the slide it's got in front of it and says, well, where does that match with what I've been trained? Um, well, if something new comes along, it hasn't been trained, it's never seen it before, it's ineffective. Well, who is going to undertake this new method of whatever it might be of scanning if there's no doctors left practicing in that area? Um, Real questions for the NHS, I think. Next slide, please. Meet your surgeon. Consenting for AI. I've been advising not just local trusts, but I've been advising the government on this as well. And I have to say, I got a few things wrong, including the speed with which this technology is being integrated. So I understand that, I think it's in Australia, there's now um, um, trials ongoing of fully automated robotic dental surgery, which sounds terrifying to me, but there we are. Um, and again, I mean, we simply don't have a handle on the integration of AI in this country. It's not being recorded centrally. I think there's a huge amount more is happening than I know about. Huge amount more is happening than the public know about. But it's here and it's present, and it happened a lot faster than I thought it would. So I've given you the example of um, the guy who had his valve replacement in Newcastle. I gave it to you early just so you had a chance to think about it. Go back to that now in your minds. if there had been a full informed consent discussion in relation to that proposed surgical approach, I personally find it very difficult to understand how the patient was convinced or decided to go ahead, which leads me to conclude that perhaps there wasn't that discussion. But you are all going to be having these discussions at some point. And there will be a very heavy imposition on you to make sure that patients are aware that essentially we're dealing with experimental technology. And um, and that will be a key part of the informed consent procedure. The transition will be difficult because we'll be moving from a situation where we have a lot of built-up experience and risk factors based on audits and analysis to an area where we really don't have very much, where surgeons are using these tools for the very first time. Carrying patients with us on that journey is going to be challenging, and there's going to be litigation because, as I say, if we're not doing informed consent correctly now, what confidence can we have that we're going to be doing it correctly in the future when it is intrinsically going to be much more complicated? Next slide, please. Yeah, I won't say very much about this because there isn't time, but there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done around an understanding of liability for AI when it goes wrong. Very, very difficult. So some trusts are developing AI tools themselves and then selling them on to other trusts. Well, who's liable if there's an error? Is it the trust that created the AI? Are you insured in that respect? If you're buying AI in from third-party providers, again, are you able to go back to those third-party providers if there's a flaw in the AI? All kinds of very, very complex issues. The coding of AI is typically black boxed, so you will be using equipment essentially of which you have no detailed technical understanding as to how it's been coded. You'll be putting your faith completely in these third-party providers. Well, if it's been coded correctly, who's going to pay? Is it you? Is it them? Lots of contractual issues, lots of indemnity issues. I have to say, nobody's really talking about this. We're rushing headlong into the adoption of technology without having thought about some of these implications. So I'm going to have to wrap up. Just next slide, please. I always finish these lectures with this slide and this very short anecdote. I don't like this slide. But when I first started talking about consent, I had a junior associate of mine try and put some slides together, and this was the final slide, and I've kept it in because it allows me to say this. So it reads at the moment: have you given enough information so that you as a doctor are not acting negligently and in giving protection to the patient's right of autonomy? Well, I don't like that because it's a statement of medical, it's kind of very defensive. Yeah. Forget not acting negligently. We don't need that. It should just say this: have you given enough information so that you as a doctor are protecting the patient's rights of autonomy? And if we put that front and center of every consent discussion that we have, then we won't go far wrong. But we're manifestly not doing it now, and we have to find a way to change. Thank you. So that was very, very quick. I apologize for that, but I kept to time, I think.
You did, David. Thank you so
Welcome.
much. Apologies about the technical issues there. That was
No, not at all.
a disappearing mouse which came back to life, luckily, thankfully. Thank you so much. I mean, a fascinating talk, and I feel like we've been on a real journey from not learning enough from our mistakes right through to, you know, capturing data and trying to learn from our data, trying to learn from the processes that cause the mistakes, right through to actually what we're saying to people before we ever operate on them, and all those pitfalls of the different ways in which we can potentially do things nowadays. It's been a bit of a roller coaster journey.
Absolutely.
A bit exhausting, if you like, because it makes you feel very aware of potentially how vulnerable we all are to getting that level of information right for everybody's benefit. And I don't want to feel defensive. I do want the patients to be able to make that choice. And you know me, I've always tried hard to do that. But it can be very difficult. Can be very difficult. There is a brief question about the e-consent example that you mentioned. I think perhaps we'll have that one question and then we will need to wrap up.
Sure.
Nearly out of time.
What was the question specifically?
It says, could you speak further on the e-consent example that you mentioned?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an analogous example. I dealt with a very big case which involved a family who come over from Iran, and they had one child over there, and the lady was pregnant here and was clocked into an antenatal clinic, and she ultimately gave birth to a child with Down syndrome, a very severely disabled child. And her suggestion was that she had never been told about antenatal scanning options. Had she been told, she would have gone through that process and ultimately had a termination. I thought that was strange because I've got a couple of kids, and I remember the process very specifically. So we went back to that hospital, and we were able to get the electronic record of the particular antenatal clinic up. I'd said very clearly there's a series of questions and drop-down answers that have to be completed. And there was a question: has antenatal screening been discussed? The drop-down was yes. Has information leaflet been provided? Drop down, yes. What was the decision? Drop down, patient declined. We even went back and got the metadata that sat behind those entries to prove they've been made contemporaneous to the clinic and hadn't been amended since. That sounds like a pretty slam dunk defense, doesn't it? Well, I lost that case. I don't lose many, but I lost that case, and it cost about £5 million. And this is why I lost it. And this is the relevance to e-consent. The judge said, and he's not right, but he said this. He said the decision to refuse antenatal screening is so unusual, that's where he's wrong, that simply ticking a box was insufficient, and that there should have been almost a free text description in the medical records of a discussion that had taken place to demonstrate that the patient was properly informed of the risks and so on and so forth, and had made a decision to refuse, fully informed of all the circumstances. That's relevant to e-consent. I think it's probably pretty obvious why it's relevant. A tick on a form, whilst it seems to me, and it may very well seem to you, or to constitute very good evidence of what's been discussed, there are still going to be circumstances where you need to be able to expand and provide more detail on specific points. And if you're operating within a very restrictive e-consent program that doesn't allow that, you may very well have a problem. So that was my example.
Thank you, David. I think it actually brings me back to a case we discussed in our advisory board meeting this morning, and that wasn't a consent issue, but it was a checklist issue. And when you ask a yes/no question, it's easy, dare I say it, not to fully engage your brain and consider the answer.
Exactly.
Whereas, so that the particular question was, is there a site mark? Yes, no. Whereas if the question had been, where is the site mark? The thought process would have given that much more. There would have needed to be more detail. Where is the site mark? Is it on the right leg or is it on the left leg? And that was probably a more appropriate question. It's not exactly the same, but it is in the sense that you need a bit more background information, and ticking a box leaves us somewhat vulnerable. I think that's what you're saying, and it's really important. I see that Anna's written in the chat that it's really important to document what you say, and I've worked with you for a long time, so I always try and say the patient asked this question, so that you can document that you did have a conversation with them and what their particular concerns were, and they may not feel like big concerns to you, but they were relevant to them.
Absolutely.
It's really important to capture that.
Absolutely.
There's a follow-on question about whether the lady in question had the information in a language that she could understand. But
it's a great question, and I wish I could give you my full talk, but we simply don't have time. That is a very important question in situations where we have got remote consent processes. And I've been through cases exactly like this, where a colonoscopy case comes to mind in particular, where a lady or a gentleman, I forget now, was given an information leaflet, the consent form, and a date for surgery or a date for colonoscopy, and sent away. No discussion, just given the information leaflet. And there are cases when actually that stuff is posted out and it's not even handed over. And as the questioner says, I think implicit in the question, that then leaves you making a number of assumptions. So if you post it, you're assuming it's received. Then you're assuming it's in a language that can be understood. If indeed the person can read at all, you're assuming that it's at a level of writing and grammar that they're capable of understanding. And if you knew the statistics for the number of people in the country who can read to grade C GCSE equivalent, you'd be shocked because it's very, very small. And you're assuming they've understood what they've read. I'll wrap up. My advice on that, and it's been incorporated into some consent forms, it is to make sure it is specifically recorded that the patient has been given an opportunity to ask questions. There you go. I see that comment. To ask questions about the information they've been provided. So at least we can demonstrate that we gave them the opportunity to ask questions. If they didn't ask questions, that's kind of on them. But that was a very good point.
Yes, I mean it's a, dare I say it, a can of worms, and we could talk about this for a long, long time. But I am.
You better shut me off, otherwise.
Yeah, I'm going to say I'm mindful of the time. I'm very grateful that lots of people have stayed to listen. I think that's a testimony to the fact that they were really interested in what you had to say, David. So thank you so much for joining us today, for your time. And I know we cut you short a little bit because you obviously have a huge amount to say, and I know that from listening to you in the past. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I know some of them have had to leave us already, but I think it's been a great afternoon. Thank you to everyone for signing up. Some good discussion there, and I hope you'll access the talks on the website and encourage those who weren't able to come today to access them as well. Once again, thank you very much. Have a good Friday afternoon. Have a good weekend.